Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree and today I'm talking about why I like G-Funk so much. If you follow me on Twitter, Stephanie Bree 22, you know I talk a lot about G-Funk, West Coast gangster rap, but specifically G-Funk. So before I can get into why I like or what I like about G-Funk, let's define G-Funk. G-Funk is a very specific sound. It's a very specific style of West Coast gangster rap. So it was pioneered by Andre Young, also known as Dr. Dre, who is famous for doing starting the group NWA, and he's done other stuff we're not going to talk about. And he started a record company called Death Row Records. So G-Funk started with Death Row, and the first widely recognized G-Funk album is Dr. Dre's The Chronic from 1991 or 92, I believe. I think it was 92. So, if you go back to the 70s, there was a group called Parliament Funkadelic, and they made a very specific sound of funk called P-Funk. So think about that. When hip-hop came on the scene in the 70s, it was basically taking the breaks, the part of the song where they stop singing and they just let the band play, for a little bit so you can dance. These were dance songs, mostly disco, funk, jazz, that sort of stuff. They would take the break, and what they would do is they would have, this is why they have two record players, two turntables. They would play the record on turntable A and let the break play, and then when it was coming to the end, they would flip over to record player B, and the break would continue, and then they would rewind record A while they were playing record B, and then they would just loop it. While they were doing this, the Master of Ceremonies, also known as the MC, later on we would call them the rapper, would talk over the record, and he would get the crowd hyped. And eventually they would start rapping, and then this evolved into what we call hip-hop, and eventually hip-hop culture. In the mid-'80s, a budgeting version of hip-hop was starting to come out of Los Angeles, California, and one of its suburbs, Compton. And this was the West Coast gangster rap. It started with Dr. Dre's group, NWA. I am not going to tell you what NWA stands for. I'm too white for that. But I am going to tell you, you can Google it yourself. And they are famous for producing a song called Fuck the Police. And they did other stuff. If you listen to the CD, the record, the tape, the album, Straight Outta Compton, that's what it's called, there are hints at what would later become G-Funk in that sound. In the New York rap, mostly they were sampling disco songs and like Latin funk and Latin kind of songs, like upbeat kind of, like think of Miami Sound Machine, that kind of stuff. And so it had a more pop sound to it. Well, on the West Coast, they were mostly sampling blues and funk, P-Funk specifically. And so it had a more bluesy sound. It wasn't something you could dance to necessarily. It wasn't dance music. It was a new form of rap called street poetry, which would evolve into what we call G-Funk or gangster rap. One of the biggest names in G-Funk is Tupac, also known as Tupac Shakur. He's very, 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 very famous for being murdered, and his beef with the New York rap crew, Bad Boy Records. So you had Death Row versus Bad Boy, East Coast versus West Coast, blah, 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 blah. That's all in the past. And Dr. Dre left NWA. He left Ruthless Records, and he formed his own company, Death Row Records. And he partnered with a guy named Suge Knight. And he developed a new sound that would layer P-Funk samples on top of blues samples. And so you would have this mix of like funk and blues. And it had this very distinct mellow style. most New York rappers at the time were all about how fast can you rap. It was about telling a story, but telling it quickly. It was all about the flow, being a faster, more accurate rapper. So it was all about, the one-upping each other. The West Coast rap was more mellow, laid back. It was slow talking. It was telling a story. Now, in the early days of hip hop, it was all about telling a story. But then it would later morph into more of a party stuff, a party scene. So it would become more like club music, where the rapping was more about bitches and hoes and drugs and clubs and cars and guns and stuff. So it was all about bragging about how rich you are and how much shit you had and how famous you were. On the West Coast, it was about telling stories of what life was like living in the ghetto. Being black in a white society that, has cops who target black people. So their stories were more real. They're more down to earth. They're more graphic. They're more violent. They are considerably more misogynistic because in the gang life, women are hoes, also treated as prostitutes, and the men are the gangsters, the thugs who rule the streets, and it's a lot of gang wars and violence and drug dealing and stuff like that. So how did I get into G-Funk? I'm white as snow. How did I get into this black music? Well, okay. For starters, I was a teenager in the 90s when this shit was blowing up and everybody was listening to it. So I discovered it around a little bit earlier than most people did, because most people discovered G-Funk with Doggy Style when Snoop Doggy Dogg came out with his album Doggy Style in 1993. I had already been introduced to it with The Chronic. Now, The Chronic is considerably darker and more authentic in tone to the gang lifestyle than Doggy Style was. Doggy Style was more, it was G-Funk, but it was polished and more pop to sell records. It was like, hey, we got to make money somehow. Let's put an album out there that takes everything we've already pioneered, but borrows just enough from the East Coast dance scene to make it accessible and palatable to the masses. So you start with The Chronic, which is hardcore, and then you have Doggy Style. Well, let's be real. It's still pretty hardcore, but it's, it's more accessible. It's a little bit more polished. It's a little bit more pop. There are no pop dance tracks, danceable club tracks on The Chronic. There aren't any. That's not the point of the album. There are a couple of danceable pop tracks on Doggy Style, and that was by intention. It was by design. The first one is What's My Name, Who Am I by Snoop Doggy Dogg. This is the one that came out on MTV and it got all the buzz. This was the dance song, the radio song that everybody listened to. The other single from the album was Gin and Juice. This was unlike anything you'd ever heard before. Gin and Juice was laid back, mellow, bluesy music, soft, but it was still rap, it was still gangster rap, and it's literally a day in the life of Snoop Doggy Dogg, Calvin Broadus. And that's it. So, I'm an English, I studied English in college. I was a broadcasting major, but I minored in, we'll say English. I studied linguistics in college, so I have a fascination with the English language. And by extension of that, I have an affinity for poetry. And so G-Funk, by and large, there are outliers on both coasts, but by and large, G-Funk is more poetic than other forms of hip-hop. Now, one of the less controversial G-Funk artists, who some would say isn't G-Funk, but I say is because he's definitely West Coast, and he has all the sounds, the samples that you're used to, is Coolio. Coolio's second album Gangsta's Paradise has a track called Gangsta's Paradise, which is sort of a mainstream, watered down take on the G-Funk sound. In the interim between Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg's albums and Coolio's 2 albums, the first one, It Takes a Thief, which is a little more edgier than Gangsta's Paradise, but not by much. You also had Warren G, who was Snoop Dogg's cousin, or was it Dr. Dre's cousin? He's one of their cousins. Anyways, he was in a group called 213, which was Snoop Dogg, Nate Dogg, and Warren G. Now, 213 didn't get a solo album until way later, but that's neither here nor there. But the artists, Snoop, Warren G, and Nate Dogg, were all featured prominently on The Chronic and prominently on Doggy Style. So they all got their solo albums. And this is how you built up Death Row Records, which was building up the library of what we would call G-Funk. Now, sidestep for a second, we still had NWA. They had broken up by this point. You still had Ruthless Records. You still had Eazy-E, who was producing his version of West Coast Gangsta Rap, which is decidedly not G-Funk. Well, in his feud with Dr. Dre, he rips off Dr. Dre's sound, and he starts making his own G-Funk albums, and he puts out a group called Bone Thugs-n-Harmony, which is a pseudo-rap group, pseudo-R&B group, but they're also G-Funk. And then he's like, hey, motherfucker, I can do this stuff too. And then, separate from NWA, having left the ashes of NWA, Ice Cube goes out on his own, and he starts morphing into the G-Funk sound. And he brings with him a guy named WC and another guy named Mac 10. And they create their own sound, their own version of G-Funk. So you got Death Row, you got Ruthless, and then you got what Ice Cube and his crew are doing. And I don't remember what record label Ice Cube was with because he bounced around. So forgive me for not being able to identify his label. But basically you had 3 branches of separate individual groups creating this new G-Funk sound. And you got Westside Connection, which was Ice Cube, WC, and Mac 10, came together as a supergroup and created an album called Bow Down. And then Ice Cube went into Hollywood, and that's that. He pretty much lost his way as far as music goes. And then you had Tupac. Now, let's back it up a little bit further. There was another sort of funk, sort of rap group that wasn't G-Funk, but they were more like a hip-hop P-Funk group called Digital Underground. Now, what I mean by that is they were a band. They had a drummer. They had a bass guitarist. They had a keyboardist. They had a guitarist. They had a band. A full, proper band. Creating new P-Funk music. But they were rapping instead of, singing. Which is, it's a weird distinction. It's like, you know it when you hear it, but you can't really describe it. And one of the members of Digital Underground was a man named Tupac. Tupac was a breakout. He got a solo album, spun off from Digital Underground. He got a couple, 2 or 3 solo albums, producing what we would call G-Funk, even though it was more technically P-Funk with rap music. It's complicated. It's messy. Well, Tupac would end up going to prison for a little bit, and then when he gets out of prison, Dr. Dre and Suge Knight come to him and say, hey, come work for us. And they sign him to Death Row Records. And they produce, by my opinion, by my estimation, the greatest G-Funk album of all time. A 2-disc set, All Eyes on Me. Now, I have in the past said that Doggy Style is the greatest G-Funk album of all time. I kind of flip-flop on that, so, pick your poison. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, they perfected G-Funk by the time Tupac got into it. So there was no more fucking around. So they fucking had everybody on All Eyes on Me. It was a 2-disc set, and it had the entire Death Row repertoire. Every backup artist, every backup vocalist, everyone who worked for Death Row Records worked on All Eyes on Me. This was their magnum opus. Unfortunately, Tupac also had a double life. He was a real world gangster in real life. He was not a rapper. He was a gangster who rapped. He was like a lot of the West Coast rappers. He was an actual street thug. He was whichever gang it was. I don't remember if it was Crips or Bloods. I don't remember. It gets messy. He had a beef with the East Coast, with Bad Boy Records. I'm not going to get into that. It's been well fucking documented. Somewhere along the lines, somebody put out a hit on Tupac and he was murdered. Okay? So he dies. He dies weeks, mere weeks, before All Eyes on Me comes out. Just after All Eyes on Me comes out, Snoop Dogg releases his sophomore album, The Dogfather, which is his last G-Funk album and his last record he did with Death Row. After Tupac died, things get messy, and long story short, Snoop Dogg leaves, Suge Knight goes to prison, Dr. Dre leaves, and what's left of Death Row Records just sort of languishes. When Dr. Dre left Death Row Records, he decided G-Funk was dead. He was not going to produce it anymore. He swept it under the rug and said it's over. When Tupac died, Snoop Dogg decided he wasn't a gangster anymore. He was a pimp. He rebranded from a gangster, from a drug dealer, to a pimp. And he said, look, let's knock it off with this bullshit killing each other. We need to just knock it the fuck off and stop killing each other. And he went to go work for No Limit Records under Master P. And he produced a lot of Southern rap, which is not Snoop Dogg's style. So, you know, let's just throw that out there. And then Dr. Dre started a new company called Aftermath Records. You know, in the aftermath of the ashes of Death Row Records crumbling. Dr. Dre, in his, we'll say, infinite wisdom, signed a motherfucker named Marshall Mathers, also known as Slim Shady, also known as Eminem, and the rest is fucking history. From then on, nobody was producing G-Funk anymore. It died cold turkey. Full stop, it just died. It stopped. It was no more. Let's back it up one more time. Eazy-E was producing G-Funk in the 90s as well. What happened? Long story short, he was a crack dealer. And he contracted HIV because he did a lot of needles. He died of AIDS. And his record company died with him because there was nobody left to run it. So somebody, I don't even fucking know, I don't care, somebody bought the ashes of what was left of his company and they went on. But without Eazy-E producing G-Funk, without Dr. Dre producing G-Funk, with Suge Knight in prison, Snoop Dogg refusing to do it, there was nobody left to produce this music. It died cold turkey. It just stopped. And it has never been, nobody on either coast has produced a G-Funk album since. They've produced gangster rap, sure, but nobody is producing this specific style of gangster rap anymore. It is a time capsule of the 90s. It is stuck in the 90s. It was birthed in the 90s. It died in the 90s. It exists exclusively in the 90s. There is no 80s G-Funk. There is no 2000s G-Funk. It is all 90s, 100%. Okay, that's the roundabout history. Why do I like it so much? For starters, it's fucking fascinating. The story behind it is fucking fascinating. This is a lot more interesting than some dude in New York had a club and got lucky, which is like 95% of your success stories in the West, on the East Coast. It was some dude owned a nightclub and he just got lucky and turned it into a phenomenon somehow. This is a lot more interesting. Let's back it up one more time. We're talking about these were real street gangsters. Eazy-E made all of his money to launch Ruthless Records, to buy the equipment, to get the records produced, to market them, to sell them. Selling crack. That's how he made his money. So he was a legit gangster. Selling crack to pay for his hip-hop endeavors. And all of the music, all the stories, all the track, all the songs, all the lyrics are telling these stories these men saw and witnessed. About 70% of your G-Funk songs are A Life in the Day of so-and-so. Pretty basic. The other 30% are depictions of gang violence. Songs like Serial Killer by Snoop Doggy Dogg, Murder Was the Case by Snoop Doggy Dogg, The Day the N-Words Took Over by Dr. Dre, Rat-a-Tat-Tat by Dr. Dre, Ice Cube and Dr. Dre's Natural Born Killers. Songs like this. Songs that depicted gang violence. Tupac's Hit 'Em Up, as an example. So most of them were just literally a day in the life of the gangster, but the rest of them were the nightlife, the darker side. You know, the killing, the murders, the covering up the murders, things like that. So it's a lot more fascinating from a historical perspective because you're learning about this the struggle that these black people faced in the ghetto, in the real ghetto, and not the crummy neighborhood downtown in your little white ass neighborhood. We're talking the real fucking ghetto. Okay? The sound. G-Funk is a beautiful sound. It is smooth jazz, blues, and funk. It is mellow electric guitars. It is mellow saxophones. It is mellow electronic keyboards and synthesizers, mostly high-pitched MIDI sounds, and a lot of fucking bass. Warren G described it as the rhythm is the treble and the treble is the rhythm. Something along those lines. It's complicated, but it's a distinct sound. You know it when you hear it, but it's really hard to describe. The best way to describe it is smooth. That's the best way to describe it. It's very blues heavy, very jazz adjacent, very funk heavy, very smooth, very mellow, very laid back. But the lyrics are hardcore. The rapping is smooth, mellow, laid back, but the lyrical content is hardcore. And that's what's so fascinating about G-Funk. There you go.